Good morning, everyone. I hope you're having a great Dreamforce. This is Sri Kolagani. I am a senior Salesforce developer at Western Union. I work at the San Francisco office. So today, let's talk about Docker containers. Let's talk about how we can deploy them in Heroku. And let's talk about similarities between Docker containers and Heroku containers. And then we can have a Q&A. So pretty simple agenda. I will also walk you guys through a demo of actually pushing a Docker image and then deploying it to Heroku and then going and visiting it. So I'm sure as a developer, I have heard this many times, and I myself have quoted it many times. It works on my machine, not yours. So why am I developing an app then, right? So we are fortunate today to live in a technology world which gives us a best and efficient ways to actually innovate and build applications. And I pretty much think Docker is one of them. So Docker is an open source platform that allows us to actually create, manage, and deploy application containers on a common OS and with a set of valid tools. So the container, so the Docker is set of tools. So Docker helps us to run the containers on the common OS, which is wonderful, which makes it lighter when compared to virtual machines. So basically, a container packages the application service or function with all the libraries, configuration files, dependencies, and all the necessary parts for the application to actually function. So each container shares the services with the underlying OS, which is the beauty of the entire container concept. So comparing to the containers and virtual machines, as I mentioned earlier, right? So containers are basically abstraction of the app layer, whereas the virtual machines are the abstraction of the entire physical hardware, which makes it a larger file. You're talking about few gigabytes, right? Whereas in the case of containers, you're talking about megabytes or lighter than that, right? You can make your container as light as possible, and it's all about finding the light libraries and putting in a proper Docker file or a build file. So as I mentioned earlier, each container actually shares the OS binaries, and it will share the OS kernel with your underlying host machine, which makes it super light. So like you look at the picture, you can see the actual difference between a virtual machine and a Docker container. So in the virtual machine, when you're actually hosting an application, you're also taking the guest OS. Whereas in Docker container, your host OS serves all the binaries and kernel files that are required, right? So the best app development can be done when we actually combine both of them. Let's get the virtual machines and let's put the containers on them. And that's when you can innovate. You can build some really great apps. So how can you take the journey of a Docker container to Heroku? Like, what is the journey? So what does it take to actually push a Docker container to Heroku? So before we actually look at the actual demo, right? So let's look at what are the similarities, what are the analogous terminology we have, and let's compare the terminology of a Docker and Heroku itself. So in Docker, we have a Docker file, which kind of states all the configurations or all the configurations you want to go into the container, and it's similar to the build file or the build pack we have in the Heroku. And the Docker image is comparable to the Heroku slug, and the Docker container is comparable to Heroku Dino. And whereas the Docker index is basically compared to the Heroku add-ons, which we have got. And then Docker itself has got its own CLI, like our very own Heroku does. So let's move the magic to Heroku. Let's unleash the power of Heroku CLI, and we are all going to do it from the command line interface. So all we need to do is we need to install the Heroku container registry plugin, and then log into the container, clone the GitHub repository, and then push the image, and then release the image. It's as simple as that. So let's get docking. So this is my terminal. So I have installed the Heroku registry container plugin. So I'm directly logging into it so that I can make it faster. Oh, really? Sorry about that. OK, perfect. OK, so I've logged in into my container. And now I'll go ahead and actually clone the GitHub repository. So the application which I'm currently cloning is the Lightning resume I submitted to my first job. So it's totally a static Lightning Node.js app, so which basically voices out my profile and kind of quotes what all I've done, right? So I've cloned my application. Now I'll move to the application directory. OK. So now I'll go ahead and create a Heroku app itself, right? df18 Docker demo. Awesome. So once we have the app ready, and we have the app ready, so let's try to push the Docker image. So basically, what's there in the repo is basically a Docker container which hosts a Node.js application, and on the top of Node.js application, we have a static Lightning web application, like an Express server, right? So push web. And to push a Docker container, it's a very simple command. We just say Heroku push web, and we name the application. In our case, the application name is df18 Docker demo. So once we do this, Heroku will start pushing the Docker file. So it will take some time. It will at least take 2 minutes. So basically, what we're trying to do is basically send a container to Heroku. And as you all by now must have realized, Heroku is a Linux container itself. It's a Linux container on cloud, right? So we are trying to make it easy because all the developers are now into Docker. So we want to make that local Docker container and then push it to cloud in no time, so that we don't need to really worry about the infrastructure and the time it takes for the developer to actually put his Docker image on cloud. So once the image is pushed, we got to release the image. And once the image is released, it's publicly available. So in simple 5 steps, we are actually able to push a Docker image and make the application live on Heroku. And I feel it's extremely simple as a developer for me to actually go and do it. So let's give it a moment. So once we have it pushed, awesome. Looks like it's pushed. OK, so it says your image has been successfully pushed, and then you can release it. So once the image is pushed, we are now releasing the image, and we are going to make it live. We are going to make it live in Heroku. So the command is Heroku container release web, and then we give the application name, which in this case is df18 Docker demo. And once we do it, we have released the image to the web, and now it's publicly available. So we can just go and open it with a simple command, Heroku open, right? So this is the application. And this is the resume I was talking about. So this is entirely a Docker container. And it's live in 3 or 4 minutes, right? So that's what Docker and Heroku they actually make the developer life simple, right? So let's go back to my presentation. OK, so what are the benefits of running on Heroku? Because it's a maintained infrastructure, I don't need to worry about my delivery pipeline or the infrastructure configurations or the security, right? Everything is offered by Heroku. And even my container orchestration is taken care by Heroku, which is a huge relief to me. And then I can also, and the networking and the routing and the domain assignment is also done by Heroku, which is great. And then Heroku has got some amazing add-ons which we can actually make use of and use it and integrate it with our own Docker containers. And then we have a world-class security and operations team, so we have someone to contact if something is wrong, which is great in terms of Heroku. So that's all. That's all about Heroku and Docker. So I'm opening it for the questions.
Hey, yeah, just wanted to know if you guys have tested this with Docker Compose, and how will you also push images for like databases or any other services? How do they tie to actual Heroku add-ons?
OK. So yeah, that's a good question. So actually, when I'm building my container, a Docker container, I will then create an image which actually talks to my PostgreSQL, which sits on Heroku. So Heroku also offers database as a service. So I install my Postgre add-on, and then I configure my Docker image to actually talk to the Postgre add-on so that all the data you want can be queried and can be manipulated directly onto the database of Heroku. Else, if you're on Salesforce, I will just make a REST API call. So in this case, I have demonstrated a static application, but technically speaking, you want dynamic application, something which your customer can interact with and can do a CRUD operation on, right? So in that case, I would do a REST API calls to whatever database I want so that I'm able to do the DML. So essentially, your Docker container is the core of it. So Heroku just manages the hosting part of it.
Do you have any experience doing like rollbacks? Like say you released a version, you have to roll back real quickly. Is there any advantages using the container? Because I saw the release command. And then also, what about doing like A/B testing? Is there a way to maybe push out like a new app only to certain users? Is that easier with this approach?
So I feel it's super easy because there is an option of actually pushing the image and then releasing the image, right? So what I would technically do is I would push an image, and if you have an enterprise Heroku account, I would be able to host multiple applications, right? So I would design a delivery pipeline in such a way that I would test my container on a dummy URL or a dummy application, and then I will push it and release it and automate it using the Heroku delivery pipeline, and then only release it when I am comfortable with it. We can actually trigger that. That's what I'm going. Any more questions? Sorry?
Do you have any trailheads you recommend?
I would recommend looking at the Heroku documentation. So they have some amazing documentation on how simple it is to push a Docker image, Docker container to Heroku. So it's very precise, and you can get started with it. It's way simpler. Any more questions? OK. Yeah.
Thank you, Sharma.
Thank you all. Have a great Dreamforce.